The auction yard at Wakanda, South Dakota, smelled of diesel and cold dirt that October morning in 1964. A thin wind came off the Missouri River bottoms, carrying the kind of chill that told every farmer in Clay County that winter was already leaning against the back door, waiting to be let in. The sky was the color of wet newspaper. The corn had come off the fields 2 weeks earlier, and what stood now was stubble brown and broken, stretching in every direction until it disappeared into the gray. 100 men stood around the farm of a dead neighbor, breath-fogging boots sunk into the churned mud of the yard. They had come to pick over what another man's life had left behind. Tractors, harrows, a manure spreader with the wheels gone, piles of fence wire, a wagon missing one sideboard, and off to the side, half hidden behind a stack of scrap iron, a combine that looked like something the river had spit back after holding it under for too long. A McCormick Deering number 64. Pull type. 13 years old. 13 years was ancient for a combine. The canvas conveyor was shredded down to threads. The sieves were bent from years of running through stones. The operator had been too impatient to stop and clear. The rasp bars on the threshing cylinder were worn smooth polished by a million bushels of corn passing over them until the ridges were gone and the bars looked like rolling pins. The drive chain hung slack stretched so far past spec that it skipped every third tooth when the auctioneer's boy tried to turn the flywheel by hand. Half the sheet metal was missing. What remained had rusted through in places where a man could push his thumb clean through and come out on the other side with nothing but a dusting of red on his skin. It was by any measure a sensible man might use a piece of junk. The auctioneer had bundled it with the rest of the unwanted. A bent grain auger, a coil of fence wire, a broken hydraulic cylinder with the seals gone, a few buckets of bolts that had never been sorted. He called the whole lot miscellaneous salvage and opened the bidding at $20. Nobody moved. 30, nothing. 40. One hand went up at the back of the crowd. Just one. A young man, tall and narrow through the shoulders, with a face that had not yet settled into the leathered look the older men around him wore. His jaw was set the way a man's jaw sets when he has made a decision and is no longer interested in discussing it. His name was Wyatt Harlan, and he was 30 years old. Sold. The gavel fell. The crowd around him looked at each other the way men do when they have just watched another man make what appears to be an obvious mistake, and they are trying to decide whether to laugh or to feel sorry for him. Wyatt Harlan did not notice. He was already walking toward the combine. He paid the clerk in cash from a roll he pulled from his front pocket. 2 20s. The clerk counted them twice, looked at Wyatt, and counted them a third time as if the money itself might change its mind. Then he handed over a paper receipt that said in pencil, $40, miscellaneous, salvage, paid in full. Wyatt folded the receipt and put it in his wallet. He walked around the combine, once slowly, the way a man walks around a horse he is thinking of buying. He ran his hand along the frame. He crouched and looked up underneath at the main shaft. He climbed onto the platform and stood where the operator would have stood, and he looked out across the row of junk equipment in the gray sky and the brown stubble, and he did not smile, but something in his face softened the way a man's face softens when he sees something that nobody else in the room can see. Then he went and got his flatbed and his Farmall M, and with a heavy chain and a good deal of patience, he loaded the number 64 onto the trailer and chained it down and drove out of the yard at a speed that would not have woken a sleeping dog. The road from Wakanda back toward his farm ran through the town of Vermilion. It did not have to. There were two other ways Wyatt could have gone, but the road through Vermilion was shorter by 6 miles, and 6 miles meant fuel, and fuel meant money, and Wyatt Harlan was not in a position that day or any day to waste either. The road through Vermilion also ran directly past the John Deere dealership. The dealership sat on the south side of the highway, behind a gravel lot that had been freshly raked that morning. Green machines stood in rows like soldiers at inspection. New tractors with the paint still glossy. New combines, self-propelled, their headers folded for display, their glass cabs catching what little light the gray sky offered. A banner hung across the showroom window. Get in before the snow flies. 0 down. 5 years to pay. Standing on the concrete apron in front of the showroom, his hands in the pockets of a sheepskin coat that had cost more than most of the coats in Clay County, was a man named Dale Bremer. Dale Bremer was the John Deere dealer in Vermilion. He had been the John Deere dealer in Vermilion for 11 years, and he was by the measure of the men who lived around him successful. He drove a new Lincoln. He wore a wristwatch with a gold band. He belonged to the country club in Sioux City, which was not truly a country club, but a supper club with a par 3 golf course behind it, and Dale Bremer liked to say he belonged to it in a way that made it sound like more. Dale Bremer knew every piece of equipment in Clay County. He kept a ledger in his office, a black leather book, and in that book he had written the name of every farmer who owned a combine, a tractor, a planter, or a grain truck in a 50-mile radius, and next to each name, he had written the make and model and year of every machine that farmer owned. He updated the ledger every time a piece of equipment changed hands. He knew who was running old iron and needed to be sold. He knew who had bought new and still owed the bank. He knew before most farmers knew themselves when a man was close to the point where the old equipment would fail and the new equipment would have to be financed. He was in the particular way that small-town equipment dealers could be. In 1964, a man who thought he understood his neighbors better than they understood themselves. He was standing on the apron with 2 other men, a parts manager, and a salesman from Sioux Falls, watching the traffic come back from the Wakanda auction. When Wyatt Harlan's Farm Mall M came into view around the bend, pulling a flatbed with something on it that Dale Bremer recognized before Wyatt had passed the feed store. Dale Bremer squinted. Then he laughed. It was not a chuckle. It was a laugh that started low in his chest and came out as a bark, loud enough that the parts manager flinched, loud enough that the 2 women coming out of the dress shop across the street looked over, loud enough that it carried through the open showroom door and caused 3 men inside to turn their heads. He raised his arm and waved it over his head. Harlan. Wyatt slowed the farm all. He did not have to. He could have kept driving. But he slowed and he brought the tractor to a stop on the shoulder across from the dealership, and he turned his head and looked at Dale Bremer, and he waited. Is that a number 64 on your trailer? It is. What did you pay for it? $40. Dale Bremer laughed again. Louder. He turned to the 2 men beside him and clapped the parts manager on the shoulder. $40. He says $40. Harlan. That machine was obsolete when Kennedy was alive. God rest him. Pull type. 6-foot header. 3 miles an hour on a good day. I have got a John Deere 45 on the lot right now. Self-propelled 12-foot header will do 3 times the work in half the time, and I will finance it for you at $4,200 down 5 years. You drive it home today. I will stick with this one. You will stick with Harlan. That thing cannot even harvest a good sneeze. The cylinder is shot. The sieves are bent. You would spend more fixing it than it is worth, assuming it is worth anything, which it is not. I have got customers who would not take that combine if I paid them to haul it away. Maybe. Maybe what? Maybe we will see. We will see. Dale Bremer turned to the men beside him and shook his head slowly. The way a man shakes his head at a child who has just announced he's going to fly to the moon on a kite. He turned back to Wyatt, and his voice dropped, and he said it with the kind of smile that was not a smile. $40 for a number 64. You know what that is, Harlan? That is a man paying $40 to lose money slower. The parts manager laughed. The salesman from Sioux Falls laughed. Inside the showroom, one of the three men who had turned his head laughed, and the laugh came through the open door and crossed the highway and settled over Wyatt Harlan like a fine dust. Wyatt did not answer. He put the Farmall M back into gear. He pulled the throttle forward. The tractor lugged, caught, and rolled, and the flatbed behind it rolled with it, and the number 64 rolled with the flatbed, and Wyatt Harlan drove out of Vermilion at the same speed he had driven, in which was the speed of a man who had nowhere to be in a hurry and no interest in pretending otherwise. In the mirror of the farm mall, he could see Dale Bremer still standing on the concrete apron, still shaking his head, still talking to the men beside him, his breath making small white clouds in the cold October air. Wyatt Harlan drove home. The drive took 40 minutes. The Farmall M was not a fast tractor, and pulling a combine on a flatbed, even a small one, meant second gear most of the way. Wyatt had time to think. He thought about the $40. He thought about the combine. He thought about the winter that was coming and the work that would have to be done in the barn by lamplight night after night between now and March. And he thought about his feverish father. To understand what happened next, to understand why a 30-year-old farmer with $340 in a savings account and a dead parent would look at a rusted, bent, wrung-out combine in a scrap pile and see something worth rebuilding. You have to understand Wyatt Harlan. And to understand Wyatt Harlan, you have to understand the man who raised him. Emmett Harlan was born in 1902. He farmed 200 acres of Missouri River bottomland in Clay County from the time he came back from the Army in 1920 until the day he died in the winter of 1960. He was a quiet man. He was careful in every sense of the word. He paid his bills on the first of the month, and he paid them in full. He did not buy on credit except once in 1938 to buy the Farmall M, and he paid off the Farmall in 2 years and never financed anything again for the rest of his life. Emmett Harlan was careful about a great many things, but he was particularly careful about one thing that almost no other farmer in Clay County was careful about: grain loss. Here's what grain loss means. When a combine harvests corn, it does not get everything. It cannot. Some of the kernels fall off the stalk before the header reaches them, knocked loose by wind or by the machine itself. Some of them pass through the threshing cylinder without being stripped from the cob. Some of them blow out the back with the chaff. Some of them fall through the gaps in the sieves. Some of them get thrown out the rear of the machine, tumbled up in the straw, and end up in the stubble behind the operator. Invisible from the cab, invisible from the road, invisible from anywhere except from the ground, where a man with good eyes and a willing back might see them if he bothered to look. Every combine loses grain. The question is how much. And in 1952, in Clay County, in all of the state of South Dakota, and for that matter, in most of the cornfields of America, the answer to that question was nobody knew, because nobody was measuring. The new self-propelled combines that Dale Bremer was selling in 1964 and that his predecessor had been selling in 1952 were fast. They could cover an acre in minutes. They had wide headers and powerful engines, and the operator sat high in the seat 10 feet above the ground and looked out over a sea of corn coming towards him, and The speed felt like progress. But speed came at a cost. The faster a combine drove, the more grain it missed. At 6 miles an hour, a typical self propelled combine in 1964 lost between 3 and 5% of the grain in the field. On a 200-acre farm yielding 120 bushels an acre, that was 720 to 1,200 bushels left on the ground every harvest. At $1.10 a bushel, which was the going rate for corn in 1964, that was between $800 and $1,300. Every year, left in the dirt. Nobody talked about it. Nobody measured it. Nobody walked behind their combines and counted. It was accepted as part of the process, the cost of doing business at modern speed. And if you had asked any of the farmers in Clay County whether they were losing grain, they would have told you, yes, a little, not much. If you had asked them how much, they would not have been able to answer. If you had asked them why they had never measured, they would have looked at you the way a man looks at another man who has asked him why he had never counted the stars. Emmett Harlan counted. The first time he counted was in the fall of 1952, when Wyatt was 18. It was a cool Saturday afternoon in late October. The corn had come off the day before, and Emmett had pulled the McCormick Deering number 52 into the shed and shut it down and cleaned it. The two of them, father and son, were standing in the yard after supper. The sun was going down. The light was the kind of long gold light that only happens in South Dakota in the last week before the killing frost, and the wind had gone still, and the whole world felt as though it were holding its breath. Emmett picked up a quart glass jar from the porch, a canning jar empty clean. He handed it to Wyatt. He picked up a tape measure and a wooden stake and a length of twine from the porch step, and he said, "Come with me." They walked out to the north field. The stubble was fresh. The kernels that had fallen were still yellow, not yet dulled by weather or by the scavenging of mice and birds. Emmett drove the stake into the ground at the edge of the field. He tied the twine to the stake. He measured off 100 feet in a straight line into the stubble. 10 feet wide, the width of the header on the number 52. He marked the corners with more stakes, and he stepped into the measured rectangle, and he knelt down. "Pick them up," he said. "Every one you can find." It took them an hour. They crawled on their hands and knees across that 100-foot strip, father and son, in the slanting gold light of an October evening, and they picked up every kernel of corn they could see lying on the ground. Wyatt's knees went numb. His back ached. His fingers grew stiff with cold. Emmett never said a word. He just picked, kernel by kernel. He dropped them into the quart jar, and when the jar was half full, he stood and he looked at Wyatt and he said, "We are not done." When they finished, the jar was nearly full, a quart of corn gathered from a strip of stubble that was 1,000 square feet, a strip that represented 1/43 of an acre. They walked back to the house. The sun was gone. Emmett lit the lamp at the kitchen table. He weighed the jar on his wife's kitchen scale. He did the arithmetic with a pencil on the back of a seed catalog. 2 8/10 bushels per acre, he said. Wyatt stared at him. 2 8/10. That is a little over 2% of what I harvested. Is that bad? It is 560 bushels over our 200 acres. At 95 cents a bushel. That is $532. Wyatt looked at the jar of corn on the table. $532 was more than the property tax on the farm. It was more than the seed bill for the year. It was more than what his father had set aside for a new roof on the house, which was going to have to wait another year. $532. Now Emmett said, "Listen to this. I run the 52 at 2.5 miles an hour. That is slow. I keep the cylinder set right and the concave tight and the sieves clean. I run careful. 2.8 bushels per acre, 2% loss. Yes. Roland Thorvald, up the road, has one of those new self-propelled machines. He runs at 5 miles an hour because the machine will take it. Last week after he finished the South 60, I walked his stubble. Same test. Same method. Same jar. Same tape measure. How much? 5.6 bushels per acre. Double. Double. On 400 acres. That is 2,240 bushels at 95 cents. $2,128. Every harvest, lying on the ground behind Roland Thorvald's combine in the stubble every fall. Wyatt did not say anything. Emmett set the pencil down. He looked at his son across the kitchen table under the yellow light of the oil lamp, and he said the thing that Wyatt would carry with him for the rest of his life. Speed does not harvest grain, son. Speed harvests most of the grain. And the difference between most and all is sitting on the ground behind Roland Thorvald's combine. And he will never know it because he will never slow down long enough to look. That conversation happened in October of 1952. Wyatt Harlan was 18 years old when he heard it. He did not forget it. He thought about it when he left the farm for a year to work in a grain elevator in Sioux City in 1955, and he thought about it when he came back. He thought about it every harvest for the next 8 years while he worked alongside his father in the bottomland fields of Clay County. He thought about it the day Emmett Harlan died. Emmett died in the first week of January 1960. He was 58 years old. He had a heart attack in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket, adjusting a chain on the corn picker. Wyatt found him an hour later. The chain was still in his hand. The funeral was small. Men from the church, men from the co-op, a few neighbors. Roland Thorvald Sr. came and stood at the back and did not say anything to Wyatt beyond a nod. Wyatt's mother, Marta, stood by the grave in a black coat that was too thin for the cold, and Wyatt stood beside her, and neither of them cried where anyone could see. Wyatt inherited the 200 acres. He inherited the Farm All M. He inherited the number 52 combine. He inherited the house and the barn and the $3,000 in a savings account at the Vermilion Bank, which was all the money Emmett Harlan had in the world when he died. He also inherited the lesson. He farmed for 4 more years with the number 52. He ran it slow. He walked the stubble after every harvest quart jar in hand, and he measured. Every year his loss was under 2%. Every year his yield ran a little higher than the county average. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked. Then, in the fall of 1964, 3 days before the corn was ready to come off the main cylinder, bearing in the number 52 seized, the housing cracked, the shaft chewed through the frame, the combine was done. 36 years of service ended in a single afternoon of grinding metal and the smell of hot grease. Wyatt stood in the shed and looked at it and knew. He had $340 in a savings account. The cheapest combine on Dale Bremer's lot was $4,200. He could not afford a new machine. He could not afford a used one at dealer prices. He could not afford to skip a harvest. He had 3 days. He went to the elevator in Vermilion that afternoon to pick up a settlement check from the previous year, and while he was there, the grain buyer mentioned in passing that there was a clean-out sale up at Wakanda that weekend. Marta Harlan gave him $40 from the kitchen tin. That is all I have, Wyatt. God help us both. He drove to Wakanda the next morning, and he bought the number 64. The first night after he brought the combine home, Wyatt did not sleep. He went out to the barn after supper. The barn was cold. He lit the kerosene lantern and hung it from a hook on the center beam, and the yellow light fell over the combine like a shroud. He stood in front of it for a long time. The machine was worse than he had realized in daylight. The sieves were not just bent. Some of them were broken, the bars snapped at the welds. The rasp bars on the cylinder were not just worn. Two of them were missing entirely. The drive chain, when he took the cover off, turned out to be held together in one place with a piece of baling wire that some previous owner had twisted on in the middle of a harvest and never replaced. He sat on the floor of the barn, his back against the wheel of the combine, and he thought about his father. He thought about what Emmett would have said if he were still alive. He thought about the kitchen table in 1952 and the jar of corn and the pencil arithmetic on the back of the seed catalog. He thought about the $532. He got up. He went into the house. He climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The attic smelled of dust and old paper. In the far corner, under a canvas tarp, was his father's trunk. He had not opened it since the funeral. He knelt in front of it and lifted the lid. Inside, on top of a folded army coat, was a small leather notebook. The leather was worn soft at the corners. Emmett had carried it in his shirt pocket for 30 years. Wyatt had seen it 1,000 times and never opened it. He opened it now. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting. Small, neat, careful. Measurements, dates, field names, yields, losses, bushel counts. Going back to 1952 and forward year by year, through every harvest until the fall before Emmett died. And on the last page, written 3 days before the heart attack in the barn, in a hand that was a little shakier than the rest, was a note. A single line, the way a man writes something he means to expand on later, but does not know he is running out of time. Son, the machine does not matter. The eyes matter. Walk the stubble. Wyatt sat in the attic for a long time. The lantern in the barn was still burning. He could see its light through the small round window under the eaves, falling across the yard and onto the side of the old combine. Walk the stubble. He closed the notebook. He put it in his shirt pocket where his father had kept it. He went down the stairs across the yard and back into the barn. He picked up a wrench. He knelt beside the number 64 in the cold yellow light. And he began slowly, carefully, without hurrying, to take it apart. Outside, the first hard frost of the year settled over the stubble fields of Clay County. And somewhere in the darkness, the wind off the river carried the smell of snow that had not yet fallen. Wyatt Harlan worked until 3 in the morning. The next day, he drove the Farmall M into Vermilion to see about a loan. He had calculated the night before that a full rebuild of the number 64 would cost somewhere between $200 and $300. New canvas, new chain, steel for the rasp bars, bearings, seals, bolts, paint. He had $42 left after the auction once he subtracted the gas to get the combine home. He needed 200 more to do the job right. He went to the Farmers State Bank of Vermilion. He had been banking there since he was 12 years old. He sat down across from the loan officer, a man named Virgil Stenberg, and he laid it out plain. $200, 6-month note. The farm as collateral, though he did not need to put up the farm, because he had been banking there for 18 years, and the bank knew him. Virgil Stenberg looked uncomfortable. Wyatt? Yes. I cannot do it. Why? Virgil shifted in his chair. He looked at the paperwork on his desk. He looked at the window. He looked at anything except Wyatt Harlan. I had a call this morning. From who? Virgil did not answer. Wyatt waited. Dale Bremer, Virgil said. He called me first thing. He said you had bought a piece of junk at a sale in Wakanda. He said you were going to try to rebuild it. He said, in his professional opinion as a dealer, that you were going to sink money into a machine that would not run, and you were going to miss your harvest, and you were going to default, and the bank was going to end up cheating, holding the paper on a failed operation. Wyatt did not move. He said it would be better for everybody, Virgil said, if the bank did not extend you any more credit until you had a realistic plan, meaning a new combine, meaning one from his lot. Virgil Stenberg did not answer that either. He did not have to. Wyatt stood up. He put on his hat. He thanked Virgil for his time, which he did not have to do, but which he did anyway because his father had raised him to thank a man, even when the man had just closed a door in his face. He walked out of the bank and into the cold October sunshine of Main Street, Vermilion, South Dakota. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. Across the street, he could see the green flags of the John Deere dealership fluttering in the wind. He could see Dale Brimmer's Lincoln in the parking lot. He got into the Far Mall M and he drove home. He did not have $200. He had 42. That night in the barn, under the lantern, with the notebook in his shirt pocket and his father's voice in his head, Wyatt Harlan began to figure out how to rebuild a combine for a quarter of what it should cost using scrap steel and tool shop leftovers and a winter's worth of his own labor. Across town in the back room of the John Deere dealership, Dale Bremer poured himself a whiskey from the bottle in his desk drawer and lit a cigar and leaned back in his chair and told the parts manager with a satisfied smile that by spring, Wyatt Harlan would be back on the lot, hat in hand, signing papers on a new 45 self-propelled, just like every other farmer in Clay County eventually did. The parts manager laughed. Out in the cold, in a barn lit by one yellow lamp, a 30-year-old farmer ran his hand along the frame of a $40 combine and began piece by piece to do what nobody in Clay County believed could be done. Something else was happening too, though Wyatt Harlan did not yet know it. When he had taken the belt guard off that first night before he went up to the attic to find his father's notebook, he had seen something inside the frame of the combine. Something small. A folded piece of paper, yellowed and soft with age, wedged into a gap beneath the main drive housing. He had pulled it out. He had held it up to the lantern. He had read the 2 lines written on it in pencil in a hand he did not recognize. And he had put the paper in his pocket next to the notebook, and he had kept working. He had not told anyone about the paper. He would not tell anyone about it for a long time. But the man who had written it was named Carl Mickelson, and that too was a story. That too was the winter of 1964 came down on Clay County the way winter always came down on Clay County, which was to say without warning and without mercy. The first hard snow fell the second week of November, 8 inches in a single night, and the temperature dropped to 4 below and stayed there for 3 days. The wind came across the open prairie from the northwest and found every gap in every wall of every barn in the county. And in Wyatt Harlan's barn, it found a great many gaps because the barn was nearly 60 years old, and Emmett had patched it instead of rebuilding it the way careful men patch things. Wyatt did not care about the cold. He wore his father's army coat and a wool cap pulled down over his ears, and a pair of canvas gloves with the fingertips cut off so he could work the small parts. And he stood in the barn night after night from supper until 2 or 3 in the morning, and he took the number 64 apart. He took it apart slowly. He did not hurry. Every bolt he removed, he dropped into a coffee can labeled with the name of the part it had come from. He had a row of coffee cans along the workbench. Header bolts, cylinder bolts, concave bolts, sieve bolts, straw walker bolts, frame bolts. Each can labeled in pencil on a strip of masking tape in his own neat handwriting, which was almost but not quite as neat as his father's had been. By the first week of December, the combine was in pieces. The barn looked like the inside of a machine that had exploded in slow motion. The frame stood bare on two sawhorses. The header lay on its side in the corner. The threshing cylinder rested on a wooden cradle Wyatt had built for it so he could turn it and inspect every inch. The sieves were stacked in a pile. The canvas conveyor, or what remained of it, was rolled up and leaning against the wall like a dead snake. And in the middle of the floor, on an old bedsheet laid out in the order they had come off the machine, were the rasp bars. There were 18 of them. They were the ridged steel bars that ran along the cylinder and stripped the corn kernels from the cob as the ears passed between the cylinder and the concave. They were the heart of the combine. If the rasp bars were worn, the machine could not thresh. If the machine could not thresh, nothing else mattered. 16 of the 18 bars were worn smooth. The ridges were gone. They looked like pieces of round bar stock polished by 13 years of friction into uselessness. Two of them were missing entirely, the welds broken at some point in the past, the bars lost in the dirt of somebody else's field. Wyatt stood in the barn and looked down at the bars on the bed sheet and did the arithmetic in his head. A new set of rasp bars, 18 of them factory made, shipped from the McCormick dealer in Sioux Falls, would cost $96. He did not have $96. He had after the auction and the fuel and the first 2 weeks of parts. He had already bought $23.40 in the kitchen tin. He could not afford the bars. He sat down on the workbench and pulled his father's notebook from his pocket, the way he had begun to do when he needed to think. He opened it to no particular page. He looked at the columns of numbers in Emmett's small, careful handwriting, and he let his eyes travel over them without reading, and he waited. After a while, he put the notebook back in his pocket. He got up, he walked out of the barn, and across the snow-crusted yard and into the house. He came back with an old metal toolbox. The toolbox had belonged to his grandfather. It was rusted at the hinges, but the latch still worked. He opened it on the workbench. Inside were hand files. Dozens of them, flat files. Round files, triangular files. Bastard files, second cut files, smooth files. His grandfather had been a blacksmith in Minnesota before he came to South Dakota, and the files were the tools of the trade he had brought with him and never put down. Wyatt picked up a flat bastard file. He weighed it in his hand. Then he got in the Farmall M and drove to the scrap yard outside of Meckling. The scrap yard was run by a man named Russell, a man Emmett had done business with for 20 years. Russell sat in a small shack with a coal stove, wearing 3 shirts and a vest. And he looked up when Wyatt came in and nodded the way men in South Dakota nod, which is to say, without committing any particular emotion to it. Tool steel, Wyatt said. Russell pointed to a corner of the yard. Wyatt went out into the cold and walked through the mountains of scrap. Old plowshares, broken axles, pieces of machinery from farms that had failed and farms that had simply grown out of old equipment and thrown it away. After 20 minutes, he found what he was looking for. 4 old leaf springs from a 1948 Chevrolet truck. Heavy, solid, high-carbon steel. The kind of steel that could be heated and bent and hardened and would hold an edge. He brought them up to the shack. Russell looked at them. $8, Russell said. 5, 7, 6. Done. Wyatt paid him in cash from the kitchen tin, loaded the leaf springs onto the flatbed of the Farmall, and drove home in the falling dark. The sky was the color of old pewter. A thin snow was starting to fall. By the time he pulled into the yard, there was half an inch on the seat of the tractor. He went into the barn, he lit the lantern, and he began. He cut the leaf springs into sections with a hacksaw, one section at a time, each one the exact length of a rasp bar. It took him 4 hours to make the first cut all the way through. The steel was so hard it ate the hacksaw blades. He went through 3 blades on the first bar. His hands went numb. His shoulder burned. He stopped twice to warm his fingers against the barn stove, which he had started when the temperature in the barn dropped below 20. When all 18 sections were cut, he took them to the bench grinder, the old one Emmett had bought, used in 1945. He turned it on. The wheel hummed and began to spin, and Wyatt picked up the first section of leaf spring and began slowly, patiently to shape it. A rasp bar is not a complicated piece. It is a length of steel with ridges cut into one face. The ridges do the work of stripping the corn from the cob. The factory made them by machine in Illinois in a press that stamped the ridges in seconds. Wyatt had no press. He had a bench grinder and a flat file and time. He worked one bar at a time. He ground the face flat. He cut the ridges with the edge of the grinding wheel one ridge at a time. He filed them smooth with a flat bastard file. He checked each ridge against a factory bar he had saved as a template, holding the two side by side in the yellow lantern light, turning them slowly to compare the depth and the angle. The first bar took him 9 hours. He threw it away. The ridges were too shallow. The angle was wrong. The bar would have polished kernels instead of stripping them. He started the second bar. By the middle of December, he had made 3 bars that he was willing to keep. By the 1st of January, he had 8. The ridges on those 8 were not uniform. They were close, but not perfect. He weighed each one on his mother's kitchen scale to make sure they were the same mass. He held them up to the template to check the ridge angle one more time. He lined them up on the workbench and looked at them, and he thought my father would have told me to start over. He started over. It took him until the 3rd week of February to finish all 18 bars. By the time he was done, his right hand had a permanent tremor in the first 2 fingers from holding the steel against the grinder. The tremor would not go away for 6 months. $8 in scrap steel. 40 hours of labor that he did not count because he had nothing else to do with the hours. A set of rasp bars that, when he finally mounted them on the cylinder and turned it over by hand, looked in the lantern light almost like the bars a factory had made. He was not finished. He was not close to finished. The canvas conveyor was next. He could not make canvas, but he had found in a surplus store in Sioux Falls that sold army goods and mill ends a roll of heavy conveyor belt that had been pulled out of a grain elevator and sold as salvage. $12 for 20 feet. He cut it to length and riveted the ends together with a leather punch and a ball peen hammer and half a box of copper rivets that cost him another $1.70. The sieves came next. The sieves were the shaking screens that sifted grain from chaff after the threshing was done. The bent ones he straightened on the anvil one bar at a time, heating them with a torch until they glowed red, and then tapping them straight with a small hammer. The broken ones he welded with his father's old arc welder, the welds crude but strong, and then he ground the welds flat and filed them smooth. He worked through January and February and into March. The snow piled up around the barn. The wind howled at the eaves. The kerosene in the lantern ran low, and he refilled it from a can in the corner, and the light flickered and steadied, and he kept working. And then one night, in the first week of March, with 3 feet of snow on the ground and a moon so bright he could have read a newspaper outside at midnight, Wyatt Harlan did something that neither his father nor any farmer in Clay County had ever done. He built a grain loss monitor. Not an electronic one. Those did not exist yet on farm equipment. In 1965, there was no sensor you could buy, no gauge. You could mount no warning light that would come on if your combine was throwing grain out the back with the straw. The first electronic grain loss monitors would not come to market until 1974, and even then, they would be expensive and unreliable. Wyatt built a mechanical one. He took a shallow metal pan about 2 feet long and 18 inches wide, and he mounted it on a steel bracket behind the discharge chute of the combine. He angled it so it would catch at a known rate a sample of whatever came out the back of the machine during operation, straw chaff, and any kernels that were being thrown out with them. When the combine was running, he could stop at the end of a pass, climb down from the farmall walk back to the pan, and look. If there were more than 5 kernels per square foot on the pan, he would know the loss rate was too high. He would adjust. Slower ground speed, tighter concave, different sieve setting. He would make the correction, and he would run another pass, and he would check the pan again. It was a simple thing, a piece of sheet metal and a bracket and a pair of eyes. It was in 1965, as sophisticated as any piece of harvest technology anywhere in the United States, because it did something that no combine, no matter how expensive, could do on its own. It told the operator what the machine was losing. By the third week of March, the number 64 was back together. Wyatt had repainted the sheet metal, what remained of it, with a half-gallon of red barn paint. He had replaced every bearing, every chain, every belt, every seal. He had adjusted the cylinder to concave clearance 1/4 of a hair, tighter than the manual specified, which he had calculated from his father's notebook, was the optimal setting for corn harvest under normal South Dakota moisture conditions. He had added a second chaffer sieve, fabricated from a piece of expanded metal he had bought at the scrap yard for $1.50, mounted behind the first sieve to catch the kernels that the first one missed. He had rebuilt the straw walkers, the long reciprocating fingers that separated the grain from the straw at the back of the machine, with new teeth he had cut from a piece of cold rolled bar stock. He had adjusted their angle a few degrees less steep than the factory had specified, which slowed the straw flow and gave the kernels more time to separate before being ejected out the rear. He had, in short, rebuilt a machine that was designed to harvest 95% of the grain in a field into a machine that was designed to harvest 99. On the morning of October 3rd, 1965, Wyatt Harlan pulled the number 64 out of the barn for the first time. The corn on his north field had reached 14% moisture, which was the sweet spot for harvest. The sky was high and blue. The wind was still. The stalks stood in straight rows, dry and brittle and ready. He hooked the combine to the far maul. He climbed onto the tractor. He put it in second gear, which on a Farmall M pulling a combine was a speed of about 2.5 miles an hour. And he began to harvest. 3 weeks. That was how long it took Wyatt Harlan to harvest his 200 acres of corn in the fall of 1965. 3 weeks. His neighbors running self-propelled combines from Dale Brimmer's lot finished their fields in 4 or 5 days. They would pass Wyatt's farm on the highway, going to or from the elevator in Vermilion with loads of grain, and they would see the old pull-type number 64, creeping along behind the farm mall at half the speed of a man walking, and they would shake their heads. Harlan is still at it. Yeah, saw him yesterday. Same field. He has been harvesting 2 weeks. He is not halfway done. Man bought a $40 combine. What did he expect? Bremer told me in August that Harlan would be back on the lot by Christmas. I am starting to think Bremer was right. At the co-op in Vermilion, the conversation was louder. The men who gathered at the back counter every morning for coffee and gossip made sport of it. They nicknamed the number 64 the Creeper. They bet quarters on how many days Wyatt would take to finish. The pot reached $6.75 before somebody took the over at 23 days, and somebody else took the under at 21, and then the auctioneer's son came in and said he had driven past Wyatt's place that morning, And Wyatt had still been on his east field, which would have taken him into the 24th day, and the pot was declared a draw. Dale Bremer was the loudest of all. He did not come to the co-op often because the co-op was a feed and seed operation and his business was equipment, but he came often enough that the regulars knew him. He stopped in on a cold morning in the third week of October, ordered a coffee, and he stood at the counter and said loud enough for everyone to hear, 3 weeks. The man is taking 3 weeks to harvest what I could finish in 3 days. Somebody laughed. He is going to miss the weather. Watch. We are going to get a storm, and he is going to have half that corn flat on the ground. He would have finished in 4 days if he had come to see me last fall. I offered him a 45 self-propelled Zero, down 5 years. He is still going to be out there when the snow starts. Dale Bremer drank his coffee. He tipped his hat to the counter. He walked out into the cold sunshine of Main Street, Vermilion, South Dakota, and he drove back to his dealership and he opened his black leather ledger and he wrote next to Wyatt Harlan's name in red ink the initials FS, which stood for forced sale. It was a notation he made when he was certain a farmer would be in the market for new equipment within the next 12 months. He was very certain about Wyatt Harlan. Wyatt finished on the 22nd of October. It had taken him 20 days of actual cutting spread across 3 calendar weeks because of 2 days of rain in the middle and a day of repair when a bearing went on the main drive shaft, and he had to drive to Sioux Falls to get a replacement. He hauled his grain to the elevator in Vermilion in the old grain truck 5 loads over 3 days because the truck could only hold 450 bushels at a time, and his yield was apparently higher than he had expected. The scale operator at the elevator was a man named Harold, 62 years old, who had weighed loads in Vermilion for 35 years and knew the yields of every farm in Clay County by heart. On the third load, he looked at the ticket, and he looked at Wyatt, and he set the pencil down. Harlan. Yes. 28 bushels an acre. Yes. On what field? The north and the east. On that ground. Yes. Harold looked out the window of the scale house. He looked at the old Farmall M in the parking lot, and at the grain truck, and at the dust settling on the ticket. The county average this year is 118. I know. You are running 10 above. I know. Harold did not say anything else. He signed the ticket. He handed it to Wyatt. Wyatt folded it and put it in his wallet in the same compartment where he kept his driver's license, and he walked out to the truck and drove home. That night, after supper, he did what his father had done in 1952. He took a quart jar from the pantry. He took a tape measure from the toolbox in the kitchen. He took his father's notebook from his shirt pocket. He put on his coat and he walked out to the north field. And in the long gold light of a late October evening, he walked a 100-foot strip of his own stubble, 10 feet wide, picking up every kernel of corn he could find on the ground. It took him 45 minutes. The jar was a third full. He took it back to the house. He weighed it on his mother's kitchen scale. He did the arithmetic at the kitchen table under the same lamp his father had worked under 13 years before. 1 4/10 bushels per acre. He sat for a long time and looked at the number. 1%. A little over. His father, running the number 52 carefully for a decade, had achieved 2.8 bushels per acre. Wyatt had cut that in half. The number 64, rebuilt from scrap in a cold barn by lamplight, was now the most efficient harvesting machine in Clay County, by a margin that nobody in Clay County would have believed if they had been told. He wrote the number in the notebook. He wrote the date. He put the notebook back in his pocket. Then he did something his father had also done. He walked Roland Thorvald Jr.'s field. Roland Thorvald Jr. had inherited his father's 400 acres in 1961. He had inherited with it a brand new John Deere 45 self-propelled combine, which his father had bought on credit from Dale Bremer the year before he died. Roland Jr. ran the 45 at 6 miles an hour because the machine would do it, and because he liked to finish fast. Wyatt waited until the Thorvald fields had been harvested, which was in the first week of October, a full 2 weeks before Wyatt finished his own. He waited a few days more for the Thorvald family to stop looking out at the stubble, and then one afternoon he drove the farm all over to the Thorvald place under the pretext of returning a chainsaw he had borrowed the summer before. Roland Jr. was not home. Wyatt hung the chainsaw in the Thorvald shed. Then he walked out into the north field of the Thorvald farm, the same field he had walked with his father in 1952, and he measured a 100-foot strip, 10 feet wide. He picked up every kernel he could find. The jar was full. He weighed it at home. He did the arithmetic. 6.2 bushels per acre, nearly 5%. On 400 acres, Roland Thorvald Jr. had left 1,240 bushels of corn lying in the stubble. At $1.10 a bushel, that was $1,364. In grain, Roland Jr. had planted fertilized, watched grow cut, and then driven right past at 6 miles an hour on his way to the next row. $1,364. Wyatt did not tell Roland. He did not tell anyone. He wrote the numbers in his father's notebook in his own handwriting now, and he closed the notebook and he put it away. He did not feel proud. He did not feel vindicated. He felt sitting at the kitchen table under the lamp the way a man feels when he has confirmed something he did not want to have to confirm. The way a man feels when he realizes that what his father told him when he was 18 years old was not just true, but more true than he had understood at the time. Speed does not harvest grain, son. Speed harvests most of the grain. That winter, after the ground had frozen and the harvest was in and the grain was sold, Wyatt sat down at the kitchen table with a pencil and a sheet of paper, and he did the math. He had harvested 128 bushels per acre. The county average was 118. On his 200 acres, the difference was 2,000 bushels. At $1.10 a bushel, that was $2,200. $2,200. More than 5 times what he had paid for the combine in one harvest. He sat at the table for a long time. Outside, the first snow of the second winter was starting to fall. The lamp flickered in a draft. His mother was asleep in the next room. The house was very quiet. He wrote the number in his father's notebook. He closed the book. He put it in the drawer of the kitchen table next to a small folded piece of yellowed paper that he had taken out of the frame of the number 64 the night he brought it home, and that he had not yet been able to bring himself to do anything about. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. The paper in the drawer had 2 lines written on it in pencil. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Not Wyatt's. Not Emmett's. The writing was cramped and hurried the way a man writes something in a barn, on his knees in a hurry, because something bad has happened or is about to happen. The 2 lines said this: Bremer lies. Walk the stubble. Tell no one I told you. No signature. No date. Just those 3 sentences written in pencil on a scrap of paper that had been folded into quarters and jammed into a gap in the frame of a combine that had sat in a field somewhere in South Dakota before it ended up at a clean-out sale in Wakanda in October of 1964. Wyatt had kept the paper for 4 months before he did anything about it. In the spring of 1966, after the ground thawed and before the planning began, he drove to the courthouse in Vermilion and he looked up the records of the clean-out sale. The sale had been the estate of a woman named Olive Mickelson. Olive Mickelson had died in September of 1964 at the age of 61. Her husband, whose name was Carl Mickelson, had died 3 years before her in 1961. Wyatt looked up the records of the Mickelson farm, 420 acres, 15 miles west of Vermilion. The farm had gone into foreclosure in the winter of 1960. Carl Mickelson had lost the farm to the bank. He had died less than a year later of a heart attack while working as a hired hand for another farmer 2 counties over. Wyatt drove out to the Mickelson place. There was a new family on it now, a family from Nebraska who had bought the land from the bank in 1962. The barn was new. The house had been repainted. The fields were black and wet and ready for planting. Wyatt did not stop. He drove back to Vermilion and he went to the diner on Main Street and he sat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee and a piece of pie and he waited for the lunch rush to clear. And then he asked the waitress, an older woman named Doris, who had been serving coffee in that diner for 30 years, if she remembered Carl Mickelson. Doris looked at him over the top of her glasses. Carl. Yes. Why? Just curious. Carl Mickelson was one of the sweetest men who ever walked into this diner. Used to come in every Saturday morning with his wife. Always ordered the same thing. Black coffee and 2 eggs over medium. What happened to him? Doris looked at the counter. He lost the farm. Yes. I saw that in the records. Do you know why? Doris took a long time to answer. When she did, her voice was low. He bought a new combine in 1958, financed it through the bank. One of those big John Deeres, 6-foot header wide platform. Dale Bremer over at the dealership set him up. Told him the machine would pay for itself in 2 harvests. It did not. No, it did not. Carl could not keep up with the payments. The machine was bigger than his operation could use. He was harvesting 400 acres, and the thing was built for 1,000. Fuel costs killed him. Repairs killed him. By 1960, he was in default. Bank took the farm. Did anyone try to help him? Doris looked up. She looked at Wyatt for a long moment. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man when she is deciding whether to tell him something she should not. Carl told me something once. In this diner. A few months before he died. He was working for Schroeder out in Yankton County. He came through town on a Saturday, and he sat right where you are, sitting now, and he drank his coffee, and he told me that he had figured something out. About the combine. About Dale Bremer. What did he figure out? Doris leaned forward. He told me that Dale Bremer was selling machines that lost grain. He told me that he had walked behind his own combine one fall the fall of 1960, and he had measured what he was losing. He said the loss was so high that it was the difference between making his payments and losing the farm. Wyatt did not move. Doris went on. He said he had tried to tell other farmers. He said he had tried to tell the bank. He said nobody wanted to hear it because everybody was buying from Bremer. And Bremer was the only dealer in town. And if you went against Bremer, you went against the bank too, because Bremer did a lot of business with the bank. Carl said he was going to document it. He said he was going to write it all down. He said the proof was somewhere the banks would never look. Where? Doris shook her head. He never told me. I asked. He said it was safer for me not to know. He said he would tell me when he was ready. He never told you. He died a month later. Wyatt paid for his coffee and his pie. He left a $1 tip for Doris, which was more than he could afford, but which he felt he owed her. He walked out of the diner and stood on Main Street in Vermilion, South Dakota, in the cold spring sunshine of 1966. And he put his hand in his coat pocket, and he felt the small folded square of yellowed paper that he had been carrying there since the previous October. Carl Mickelson had documented something. He had hidden it. He had died before he could tell anyone where. Part of it, at least, had been in the frame of the number 64 combine. What was the rest of it? Where was the rest of it? Was there a rest of it? Wyatt did not know. He drove home that afternoon. He went into the barn. He looked at the number 64, which was now sitting quietly on its wheels, rebuilt, painted, ready for the harvest that was 8 months away. He ran his hand along the frame the way he had that first day at the auction. The machine had told him one thing: Bremer lies, walk the stubble. The rest of it he would have to find himself. He did not know, standing in the barn that afternoon, that it would take him 22 years to find it. He only knew that his father had been right, that his father's father had been right, that there was somewhere out there in the brown fields of Clay County a truth about farming and about speed and about what men missed when they were moving too fast to look down, and that the truth was worth something. He went back into the house. He took his father's notebook out of the kitchen drawer. He began on a fresh page to keep a second ledger. Not just his own losses, not just his own yields. He began to write down year by year, field by field, farm by farm, the yields of every other operation in Clay County whose numbers he could find out. The elevator receipts at Vermilion were public. The county extension reports were public. The agricultural census was public. He could cross-reference, compare, calculate. He did not yet know what he was looking for. He only knew that his father had taught him to walk the stubble, and that Carl Mickelson had written in pencil on a scrap of yellowed paper the same thing 20 years before. 2 men, 2 generations, the same lesson. And in the spring of 1966, in a kitchen in Clay County, South Dakota, a 32-year-old farmer began, without knowing it yet, to gather the evidence that would one day, many years later, change how an entire state thought about what it meant to harvest a crop. But that was far away. In the spring of 1966, all Wyatt Harlan knew was that the corn needed to go in the ground, and the farm all needed an oil change, and the number 64 was ready for another harvest. And somewhere in the barn, under the red barn paint, and the rebuilt rasp bars, and the straightened sieves, a $40 combine was waiting patient as an old horse for October to come around again. He planted the corn the second week of May. The rains came good and steady through June. The crop stood tall by the end of July. And in the fields around him, his neighbors ran their shiny new self-propelled combines at 6 miles an hour, and never once in any of those summer months thought about what they might be leaving on the ground. The years did what years do in South Dakota. They stacked on top of each other, one harvest at a time, and they carried Wyatt Harlan from 32 to 40, from 40 to 50, without ever seeming to notice they were passing. He married in the spring of 1967. A woman named Jane, from a farm family in Turner County, 2 years younger than he was, tall and plain-featured and steady, with hands that had done work all her life, and eyes that did not flinch from weather or from bad news. They met at a church social in Vermilion. She came out to see his farm on a Sunday afternoon in April. She looked at the house, which needed paint. She looked at the barn, which needed a roof. She looked at the number 64 combine, which was sitting in the shed, wearing its coat of red barn paint, and it's rebuilt everything. And she walked around it once, and she looked at Wyatt, and she said, "You made this run again." "I did. Your father would be proud." They were married in June. She moved into the farmhouse with Wyatt and his mother, Marta, and the 3 of them lived together quietly for 7 years until Marta died in her sleep in the winter of 1974. Their son Garrett was born in 1968. He was a quiet child. He liked the barn. By the time he was 4, he knew the names of every tool on his father's workbench. By the time he was 8, he could tell the difference between a concave bolt and a sieve bolt by feel in the dark. Wyatt farmed. Every October, he ran the number 64. Every October, it ran slow. Every October, his yields came in above the county average, year after year, by margins that could not be explained by soil or seed or rainfall. Because Wyatt's soil and Wyatt's seed and Wyatt's rainfall were the same as everyone else's within 10 miles. Every October after harvest, he walked the stubble. Quart jar, tape measure, 100-foot strip. He wrote the number in his father's notebook, now half full of his own handwriting, and he put the notebook back in the drawer of the kitchen table, and he did not speak of it. In 1970, his loss was 1.3 bushels per acre. In 1972, it was 1.5. In 1975, in a dry year with brittle stalks, it climbed to 1.9, and Wyatt tightened the concave another 16th of an inch, and the following year, it was back down to 1.4. In 1978, it was 1.1. And every October, he walked other people's stubble too. Not only Roland Thorvald Jr.'s, he walked the fields of a farmer named Erickson south of Vermilion. He walked the fields of a farmer named Kutsen east of Wakanda. He walked the fields of a widow named Halverson, who had inherited her husband's place and hired a custom cutter from Iowa to bring in her corn every year on a big green self-propelled combine that covered 60 acres a day. Erickson, 4.9%. Knudsen, 5.3%. Halverson's custom cutter, 6.1%. The numbers went into the ledger, year after year. In the drawer of the kitchen table next to his father's notebook, next to the folded yellow paper from Carl Mickelson. Wyatt never told anyone. Dale Bremer sold him more combines in his head every year than any other dealer in South Dakota sold to any farmer anywhere. Every fall, Dale drove past Wyatt's place at least 3 times in his Lincoln slow looking. He still wrote the initials FS next to Wyatt's name in the black leather ledger every year. He underlined them in 1972. He added an exclamation point in 1975. By 1978, he had stopped updating the entry because the entry had stopped meaning anything. Dale Bremer had sold combines to every farmer in Clay County at least once. Every farmer except Wyatt Harlan. It gnawed at him. It gnawed at him in a way he could not explain even to himself. A $40 combine bought at a clean-out sale in 1964. Still running after 14 years, still coming home from the elevator with yield tickets that made the scale operator set down his pencil. It was not that Wyatt was making Dale look bad. It was that Wyatt was making Dale question something, and Dale Bremer did not like to question things. In the summer of 1979, something happened that Wyatt did not see coming. A man drove up to the farm in a long black car with Iowa plates. He was in his 60s, gray at the temples, wearing a jacket that looked like it had been tailored. He got out of the car and walked up to the porch where Wyatt was drinking coffee with Jane, and he introduced himself. His name was Lawrence Holm. He was a collector. He restored antique farm equipment. He kept a barn in Dubuque, Iowa, full of it. Threshing machines, steam tractors, pull-type combines from the 1930s and 40s. He had heard from a man who knew a man that Wyatt Harlan was still running a McCormick Deering number 64. He was. Mr. Harlan, that machine in the condition I hear it is in, original rebuild still working, still harvesting a crop every fall. That is the kind of thing I collect. I would like to see it. Wyatt took him out to the shed. Lawrence Holm walked around the combine for a long time. He did not touch it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a painting in a museum. He knelt down and looked at the rasp bars. He stood on a stool and looked at the cylinder. He ran his eyes over the welds on the sieves. He turned to Wyatt. You made these rasp bars. Yes. By hand. Yes. Mr. Harlan, I will give you $15,000 for this machine right now, and I will haul it to Iowa at my own expense. Wyatt did not answer. $15,000 in 1979 was a great deal of money. It was more than 3 years of the premium Wyatt's farm was earning above the county average. It was enough to buy a used, self-propelled combine, a good one, and have money left over. It was enough to fix the roof on the house and the roof on the barn and put a new furnace in and still have $5,000 in the bank. It was by any rational measure a man could apply a staggering offer for a $40 combine. Wyatt walked Lawrence home to his car. He told him he would think about it. He told him he would call him in a week. Lawrence Holm left his card. That night, Wyatt sat at the kitchen table. Jane was washing dishes. Garrett, 11 years old, was doing arithmetic homework at the other end of the table. Wyatt held the card in his hand and looked at it. $15,000. He thought about it for 2 days. On the third night, he did something he had not done in years. He walked out to the shed after supper. It was a warm June evening. The light was long and gold. The doors of the shed were open, and the number 64 sat inside, catching the last of the sun. Wyatt walked around it. He put his hand on the frame. He thought about his father standing in a kitchen in 1952 doing arithmetic on the back of a seed catalog. He thought about Carl Mickelson, whoever he had been writing 3 sentences on a scrap of paper and hiding it where only another careful man would ever find it. He thought about his own hand trembling for 6 months after he had finished the rasp bars. He thought about $22,000 per year for 14 years that had come out of this machine and into his bank account. Not because the machine was fast, but because the machine was careful, and he was careful, and together they had picked up what other men had driven past. $15,000 was 3 harvests of his premium. This machine would give him that premium, God willing, for another 20. He called Lawrence home the next morning. He thanked him. He told him no. Lawrence Holm was quiet on the line for a moment. Then he said, Mr. Harlan, I have made offers like that to a dozen men over the years. Most of them said yes within an hour. You are the first who said no. Can I ask you why? Because it is not a collector's piece, Mr. Holm. It is a combine. I still need it. Mr. Holm laughed gently. I understand. He never called again. The farm crisis came in 1982. You remember it if you lived through it. Interest rates climbed above 18%. Land values were cut in half. The price of corn dropped from $3 a bushel to $2, then to $1.60, then to $1.40. Grain elevators cut their basis. Banks called loans. The men who had financed the big new equipment in the 1970s, the men who had taken out second mortgages on their land to buy more land, to grow more corn, to pay for the land they had just bought, found themselves crushed under payments. They could not make on grain they had left on the ground. Clay County lost 9 farms between 1982 and 1986. The auction notices ran in the back of the county paper every week. Equipment sales, land sales, estate sales. The same notices Wyatt had scanned 18 years earlier, looking for something he could afford, now scanning for something he did not want to see the names of men he knew. Roland Thorvald Jr. was not in the paper yet, but he was close. It was a Tuesday night in February 1983, around 11 o'clock when the knock came on Wyatt's door. Jane was already in bed. Garrett was 15 years old, and asleep upstairs. Wyatt was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the county extension newsletter reading about seed varieties for the coming spring. Wyatt went to the door. Roland Thorvald Jr. stood on the porch. He was 51 years old. He was wearing a canvas coat that had been expensive 10 years earlier and was now ragged at the cuffs. His eyes were red. The smell of whiskey came off him like heat off an iron stove. Roland? Wyatt. I need to talk to you. Come inside. Roland came in. He stood in the kitchen. He did not sit. He held his hat in his hands and he turned it slowly around by the brim. For a long time, he did not speak. The bank is going to take the farm. Wyatt did not answer. In April. They gave me until April. I have until April to come up with $32,000 or they take it. How much do you have? I have $6,000. And a combine I cannot sell because nobody wants a 1974 John Deere because nobody has any money to buy one. And 400 acres of ground that used to be worth $600 an acre and is worth $280 now. Wyatt poured him coffee. He put the cup in front of him. Roland sat down at the table. He stared at the cup. He turned it slowly in a small circle on the oilcloth. Wyatt. Yes. I have to tell you something. Roland did not look up. His voice had gone quiet. The whiskey was mostly out of it now. What was left was something colder and older and harder. In the fall of 78, you remember when you had the breakdown in the middle of harvest? The gearbox on your combine. I remember. It was not a random breakdown. Wyatt, it was me. Wyatt sat very still. I came onto your place one night. I was drunk. God, I was angry. You had been running your yields 10 above mine for 13 years. And everybody was saying it was the ground. And everybody was saying it was luck. But I knew it was not the ground. And I knew it was not luck. I knew it was something you were doing. And I could not figure out what it was. And I came over one night when you were asleep, and I dropped a bolt into the intake of your gearbox. I thought it would take your machine out for the season. I thought, God help me. I thought it would bring you down to where I was. Roland looked up. His eyes were wet. But your machine kept running. I do not know how. I do not know why. The bolt must have gone someplace that did not matter, or your oil caught it or something. You lost 2 days to a bearing that I think had nothing to do with the bolt at all. I have carried this for 5 years, Wyatt. I have carried it for 5 years, and I am sitting across from you about to lose my farm, and I cannot carry it one more day. Wyatt did not speak for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the wind moved in the bare branches of the hackberry tree in the yard. Then Wyatt got up. He went to the cupboard. He took down the coffee can where he and Jane kept the farm's operating cash. He counted out $8,000 in 20s and 50s, which was most of what was in the can, and he brought it back to the table and he put it in front of Roland Thorvald Jr. No interest, no note. Pay me back when you can. Roland stared at the money. Wyatt, pay me back when you can. Roland began to cry. He did not sob. He sat in the chair across from Wyatt Harlan, and tears ran down his face, and he did not wipe them. He pushed the money back across the table with one hand. I cannot take this. You can. You will. I did not walk your fields in 1965 to hurt you, Roland. I walked them because my father taught me to. I did not keep what I saw because I was ashamed of you. I kept it because I was ashamed of myself for knowing and not telling. Why did you not tell me? Because I did not know how? Because my father told me in 1952, and he never told anybody either. Because the men in this county do not listen to what they do not want to hear, and I did not think I could be the man to make them. Roland took the money. He put it in his coat pocket. He sat at the table for another hour, and Wyatt refilled his coffee, and they did not say much. Roland left a little before 1 in the morning. Wyatt did not tell Jane about the bolt in the gearbox. He did not tell her for a long time. In the fall of 1983, Dale Bremer's dealership was close to closing. His sales had dropped by 60% in 2 years. Most of the farmers in Clay County were not buying new equipment. They were nursing what they had. Some of them could not even afford the nursing. Dale had laid off his parts manager. He had let his salesman from Sioux Falls go. His showroom had 3 combines and it all unsold, all sitting there month after month while the paint dulled under the fluorescent lights. He started in November of 1983, driving around the county looking for assets. Not farms. Farms were a losing proposition. The bank could not sell them either. He was looking for equipment. Old equipment. Unusual equipment. Things that might have value to a collector. He had heard years ago about an offer that had been made to Wyatt Harlan by a man from Iowa for the old McCormick Deering number 64. $15,000. He did not know if the offer still stood, but he knew that if he could get his hands on the combine for a few $100s, and if he could find that collector, he could clear $10,000 in a single afternoon, which was more than he had cleared in any month of the past year. On a cold Saturday afternoon in December, Dale Bremer drove out to Wyatt's place. Wyatt was in the shed pulling the number 64 off the Farmall and greasing the bearings for winter storage. He heard the Lincoln come up the drive. He did not look up. Dale came into the shed, stomping snow off his boots. Harlan. Bremer. Dale looked at the combine. He looked at it for a long time. He had not seen it up close in years. He had driven past it out in a field dozens of times, but he had never stopped and looked at it. Now, in the cold light, coming through the shed door, he did. It looks good. It is. How old is it now? 32 years? Dale shook his head. He took off his gloves. He looked at the sieves visible through the open side panel. He looked at the cylinder. He looked at the pan mounted behind the discharge. What is that? That is a grain loss monitor. A what? A pan. I watch what comes out the back. Dale Bremer frowned. He walked around to the back of the combine and looked at the pan. Harlan, I want to make you an offer. I am not selling. $500. Cash. Today. I will send a truck Monday. No. Dale Bremer stood for a moment in the cold shed. He looked at Wyatt, who had gone back to greasing the bearings. He looked at the combine. He looked at the pan. What do you mean you watch what comes out the back? Wyatt straightened up. He wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at Dale Bremer, the man who had laughed at him publicly 19 years ago on a street in Vermilion, the man who had called him in a crowd of witnesses, a man paying $40 to lose money slower. Come with me, Wyatt said. He walked Dale Bremer into the house. He sat him down at the kitchen table. He went to the drawer. He took out his father's notebook and his own ledger, and he laid them both on the oilcloth in front of Dale. Read them. Dale Bremer read for almost 2 hours. He started with Emmett's notebook. The careful handwriting, the columns of numbers, the 1952 entry about Roland Thorvald Sr.'s field, and the arithmetic on the back of a seed catalog. He went on to Wyatt's ledger. The year-by-year losses, the year-by-year yields, the comparisons with the Erickson farm, the Knudsen farm, the Halverson farm, the comparisons with farms where Dale Bremer had personally sold every combine on the place. Dale's face, when he started reading, was red with cold and irritation. By the end of the first hour, it was not red anymore. By the end of the second hour, it was pale. He closed the books. He pushed them back across the table. He stood up. He put on his coat. He walked out of the kitchen and out of the house and across the yard to his Lincoln, and he sat in it for a long time before he started the engine, and when he drove away, he drove slowly. He did not come back to Wyatt's farm that winter. He did not call. He did not send a truck for the combine. Wyatt was not sure at first what Dale Bremer was going to do with what he had read. He found out in a way he did not expect the following October. In the fall of 1984, a young woman arrived in Clay County. Her name was Elspeth Cavale. She was 26 years old. She had a master's degree in agricultural economics from South Dakota State University. She had just been hired by the Clay County Extension Office to replace the previous agent, a man named Henderson, who had retired after 31 years. Elspeth had been told on her first day on the job by the outgoing Henderson that she should look into harvest efficiency. He said it as if he were passing along an item on a list. There is a research grant from the university, $1,500. Somebody needs to use it. You are somebody. Elspeth Cavale decided to study grain loss. She selected 12 farms. She selected them at random from the tax rolls, weighted to reflect the range of farm sizes in the county. She went out to each one in September and October after harvest, and she walked a 100-foot strip of stubble on each farm 10 feet wide, and she picked up every kernel of corn she could find. She did not know, as she did this, that she was repeating exactly the procedure Emmett Harlan had invented in 1952. She did not know that she was repeating exactly the procedure Carl Mickelson had used in 1960 in a field he did not own anymore, trying to document something he had died before he could tell anyone. She did not know, as she knelt in the stubble with her quart jar and her tape measure, that she was with her own hands completing a circuit that had been open for 32 years. She measured 12 farms. The average loss was 4.8%. The highest was 7. The lowest was 1.2 on a farm, identified in her notes only as Farm 7, because she had promised the farmers anonymity. Farm 7 was Wyatt Harlan. Elspeth published her findings in the Clay County Agricultural Newsletter in November of 1984. The article was titled Harvest Efficiency, the Hidden Variable in Farm Profitability. It was 3 pages long, it had charts, it had tables, it named no names, it identified the farms by number. Every farmer in Clay County figured out the key within 48 hours. The newsletter landed on Dale Bremer's desk at his dealership the day it was mailed. He read it twice. He did not move for an hour. The men who read it at the co-op in Vermilion did not laugh. A week after the newsletter came out, Roland Thorvald Jr. came into the elevator in Vermilion to drop off the last load of his harvest. Wyatt was there picking up his settlement paperwork for the year. The two men had not spoken other than a nod since the night in February when Roland had come to Wyatt's kitchen. Roland crossed the floor of the elevator office. He held the newsletter in his hand. Wyatt, Roland. Farm 7 is you. Wyatt did not answer. 1.2%. Harlan. Do you know what my number was? I do not. 6.2. Same as in 1965. I walked my own field this year after harvest for the first time in my life. I took the jar and the tape measure out there after I read the article. I wanted to see. I filled a 5-gallon bucket, Wyatt, from one pass. I have been farming 400 acres for 19 years, and I have been leaving a full grain bin on the ground every single year. 19 years. At an average of $2 corn over that time. $15,000 a year, Wyatt. Give or take? Roland's voice was very quiet. I have left close to $300,000 in my own stubble. Wyatt did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, Roland, I have known since 1965. Roland closed his eyes. Why did you not tell me? My father knew in 1952. He did not tell your father either. Why? Wyatt thought about it. He thought about Carl Mickelson and about Dale Bremer and about the men at the co-op who had laughed at the creeper and about his father sitting at the kitchen table saying speed does not harvest grain and about the long gold light in October of 1952 and about his own 30 years of walking stubble in silence. Because we did not know how to say it so that anyone would listen, Wyatt said. Because the men in this county do not hear what they do not want to hear. My father told me once. I never told anyone else. Roland shook his head slowly. It took a 26-year-old girl to say it, Wyatt. Yes. Roland looked at the newsletter in his hand. He folded it. He put it in his coat pocket. I paid you back 3 weeks ago, he said. I know. I could not have paid you back without reading this article. I would have lost the farm in April. After I read it this fall, I walked the stubble. I saw what I had been losing. I got up the courage to go to the bank and ask for a restructured note based on what I could realistically produce if I changed how I harvested. They gave it to me. I owe you everything, Wyatt. Not just the $8,000. Everything. You owe your father, Wyatt said, who taught us both what to look for. You just had to be told to look. Roland did not answer. He shook Wyatt's hand. He walked out of the elevator office. He got into his truck and drove home. Dale Bremer came to Wyatt's farm 2 weeks later. It was the first Saturday in December. The snow had started that morning and had not stopped. The drive was covered in 3 inches of new snow when Dale's Lincoln came up it. Wyatt was in the shed servicing the number 64 for winter storage, every year in the same order, in the same way, for 20 seasons. Dale Bremer came into the shed. He did not stomp the snow off his boots this time. He walked straight in. Harlan. Bremer. I read Elspeth's article. I figured you had. Dale did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the combine. He looked at the pan mounted behind the discharge. He looked at the kitchen door visible across the yard, where he had sat a year earlier and read 2 notebooks. I sold combines in this county for 21 years. Harlan. Every one of them I sold on speed. Cover more ground. Finish faster. Get the crop in before the weather. I told every farmer who walked through my door that speed was the key. I know. The whole time. The whole time the grain was falling on the ground behind every machine I sold. Dale looked at Wyatt. His eyes were not the eyes of the man who had laughed on a concrete apron in October of 1964. Carl Mickelson came to see me in the summer of 1960. He told me he had walked his fields behind the combine I sold him. He told me he had measured what he was losing. He told me the loss was killing his operation. He wanted to know if I would work with him on the financing, if I would restructure the note, if I would help him. Wyatt waited. I told him he was making excuses. I told him that the combine was not the problem, that he was a poor operator, that other men with the same machine were doing fine. I told him to run the combine faster to make up the yield with volume. I told him to stop walking behind his equipment, counting kernels like a fool. Wyatt did not speak. He lost the farm 4 months later. He died the year after that. Dale Bremer's voice was rough. Carl Mickelson was the first man who tried to tell me Harlan. I told him he was wrong. I sold his combine at auction after the foreclosure. I sold it to a family up in Wakanda. They ran it for 3 years, and then their man died, and their widow sold it at a clean-out sale in the fall of 1964. Yes. Dale looked at the number 64. That is the machine. Yes. Dale Brimmer stood in the shed in the falling snow, and he looked at the combine that had come through 3 owners in 20 years to the hands of the only farmer in Clay County who would rebuild it the way Carl Mickelson would have wanted it rebuilt. He did not speak for a long time. I owe you an apology, Harlan. You do not owe me anything. I laughed at you in front of the whole town. I laughed at you, and I called you a man paying $40 to lose money slower, and I have been wrong about that for 20 years. You were not wrong about the machine, Dale. It is old. It is slow. It does look like junk. You were wrong about what mattered. Yes. Dale extended his hand. Wyatt wiped his own hand on a rag. They shook there in the shed, 2 men who had stood on opposite sides of a silence for 20 years, and who now stood on the same side of it. Dale left without saying anything more. He did not come back that day. But the following spring, in April of 1985, Dale Bremer put an advertisement in the county newsletter. It said at the top, precision harvesting. Below that, it said grain loss audits available. Factory set sieves no longer match field conditions. Fuel savings at moderate ground speeds. And below that, it said, we were wrong about speed. Come talk. It was the first honest piece of equipment advertising anyone in Clay County had ever seen. Dale Bremer's dealership survived the farm crisis, not by selling more combines, by selling different combines, set up differently, sold with a different promise. Over the next 5 years, Dale rebuilt his business around what he had learned from reading 2 notebooks in a kitchen in 1983 and from Elspeth Cavalli's article in 1984 and from one long conversation in a shed in the snow. He became, by the end of the 1980s, the only combine dealer in a 3-county radius who could tell a farmer with specific numbers what each machine on his lot was likely to lose per acre in a given crop under given conditions. He sent Wyatt a Christmas card every year for the rest of his life. He died in 1997 of pancreatic cancer at the age of 71. Wyatt went to the funeral. He stood at the back of the church in Vermilion, and he watched the sons of men Dale had sold combines to, and the grandsons of those men file past the casket. When it was his turn, he stood over the coffin for a long moment, and he did not say anything, because he had nothing to say that the dead man had not already understood. 3 years after this first article in the spring of 1988, a letter arrived at Wyatt Harlan's farm from a law firm in Sioux Falls. The firm was the estate of Carl Mickelson. Carl Mickelson had died in 1961. His wife Olive had died in 1964. The estate had been administered and closed in 1965. There should not have been any reason for Wyatt to be receiving a letter from a law firm handling the Mickelson estate 24 years after the last Mickelson had died. The letter was brief. It said that Carl Mickelson had, in the summer of 1961, 2 months before his death, executed a small side instrument outside of his main will. The instrument had been kept in a safe deposit box in the First National Bank of Sioux Falls. The instrument named a beneficiary by description rather than by name. It said simply that the contents of the box were to be delivered to whatever person, within 30 years of the date of execution, could prove ownership of the McCormick Deering Combine serial number 64-4417-S that had belonged to Carl Mickelson at the time of the foreclosure of his farm in 1960. The 30 years was almost up. The law firm had been for 2 decades quietly tracking the combine through its chain of custody. They had followed it to Wakanda. They had followed it to Wyatt Harlan. They had waited to see if Wyatt Harlan would still own it. He did. He had owned it continuously for 24 years. The letter said, "Please come to our offices at your convenience. We have something for you." Wyatt drove to Sioux Falls on a Tuesday in May. The law firm was in a brick building on Phillips Avenue. A young attorney brought him to a conference room. On the table was a cardboard box about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. It was addressed in pencil, in the same handwriting Wyatt had seen on a folded yellow scrap 24 years earlier, to the man who walks the stubble. Wyatt opened it at the table. Inside was a stack of notebooks, 6 of them. Cloth bound, the cover softened and darkened with age. The oldest one was dated 1936. The newest one was dated 1961. They were field journals. Carl Mickelson had kept them for 25 years. Every harvest. Every field. Every measured loss. Every comparison he had made quietly to his neighbors. Every letter he had written unsent to Dale Brammer. Every calculation he had done longhand on what grain loss was costing the farms of Clay County. On the last page of the last notebook, in a hand that was already starting to weaken, Carl Mickelson had written this: "If you are reading this, the lesson has survived. I tried, and I failed. Someone after me did not fail. Whoever you are, thank you. That is enough." Wyatt Harlan sat in the conference room on Phillips Avenue in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in May of 1988, and he cried. He did not know Carl Mickelson. He had never met him. He owned the combine that had killed Carl Mickelson's farm, and Carl Mickelson, who had died in poverty and in silence, had somehow reached across 27 years to tell Wyatt that he was not the first, and that he would not be the last, and that the work of walking the stubble had begun long before either of them and would go on long after. Wyatt took the notebooks home. He put them in the drawer of the kitchen table, next to his father's notebook, next to his own ledger, next to a small folded square of yellowed paper. 5 years later, in the fall of 1993, Wyatt Harlan, 59 years old, handed the farm over to his son Garrett. Garrett was 25. He had gone to South Dakota State for an agriculture degree. He had come home at 22 to farm beside his father for 3 years, learning the ground. He ran a new Case IH combine, now with GPS yield mapping and automatic sieve adjustment. The technology had at last caught up to what Emmett Harlan had done by hand in 1952 with a quart jar and a tape measure. But Garrett still walked the stubble. Every October, after the last pass, with a bucket and 100-foot tape, the way his father had taught him, and the way his grandfather had taught his father. Because sensors were good, but sensors were not the eyes of a man, and the only way to know for certain what you had left on the ground was to put your boots in the dirt and look. The number 64 is in the barn. It stopped running in 1992 after 27 harvests under Wyatt's hand. The main bearing finally gave out the way the number 52 had given out in 1964. Wyatt did not rebuild it. He cleaned it one last time. He parked it in the shed. He covered it with a canvas tarp. He hung the tarp himself. Over the shed door, Garrett nailed a small wooden sign he had made in the farm shop with letters he had burned into the wood with a soldering iron. "It's not how fast you harvest. It's how much you keep." Wyatt saw the sign. He looked at it for a long moment. He did not say anything. He did not need to. His father had said it all at a kitchen table under a lamp in October of 1952. Carl Mickelson had said it in a cloth-bound notebook over 25 years of failed harvests. Wyatt had spent his own life saying it in silence with a jar and a tape measure in the stubble of his own fields and his neighbors. Now, at last, someone had written it down where people could see it. That was enough. Over the 29 years he ran the number 64, Wyatt Harlan captured conservatively 32,000 bushels of corn that would have been left on the ground, by a standard self-propelled combine running at standard speed. At an average corn price over those decades of $2 a bushel, that was $64,000. $64,000 from a $40 machine and a winter's work and a father's lesson and a dead stranger's warning. The math in the end was simple. Speed is not the thing. Speed has never been the thing. The thing is the eyes. The willingness to look down, the willingness to measure, the willingness in a world that rewards men who cover ground fast to be the man who covers ground carefully and who counts afterward what the fast men drove past without seeing. Wyatt Harlan covered his ground carefully. He lived into his 80s. He died in a nursing home in Vermilion in 2019, 85 years old, with his son at his bedside and his grandson sitting in the hallway reading a farming magazine. The last thing he said before he closed his eyes for the final time was a question directed at nobody in particular that Garrett did not quite catch and was afterward never entirely sure he had heard correctly. He thought his father said, "Did I leave any on the ground?" And Garrett, whose throat was too full to answer, did not tell his father what he would have told him if he could have, which was that no, he had not. He had picked up everything that was his to pick up, and some of what was other men's, and he had left the fields of Clay County cleaner in every measurable sense than he had found them, which is what the old combine in the barn still says in its silent way every winter under its canvas tarp in the dust. So let me ask you something and sit with it for a moment. What are you driving past? Not in a field, in your life. What is lying on the ground behind you because you are moving too fast to notice? What are you losing at 5% because slowing down to 1% would take too long? Cost too much patience, look too old-fashioned to the people watching from the road. The world runs on speed. Faster machines, faster decisions, faster results. Speed works. Speed covers ground. Speed. But speed also leaves things behind. Things you planted, things you paid for. Things that belong to you sitting in your own stubble, invisible, uncounted, because you were already looking at the next row. Emmett Harlan walked behind his combine and counted. Nobody else did. Carl Mickelson walked behind his combine and counted. Nobody listened. Wyatt Harlan rebuilt a $40 machine to capture what the expensive ones missed. He harvested at half the speed and twice the precision. He picked up $64,000 in grain over 29 years that his neighbors drove right past at 6 miles an hour. The dealer laughed at his $40 combine. The combine out-harvested every machine in the county, not because it was faster, but because it was more careful. And careful, it turns out, is worth more than fast.